Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the Old Testament in this survey class. We ought to begin by asking the overall question, what is the Bible? When we use that term Bible, it's actually taken from a very ancient word just meaning book. And when we speak of the Bible as Christians, we're speaking of the books of both the Old and the New Testament. Now that brings up the question, how do we know that the right books are in the Bible? You know, a number of years ago, National Geographic, I think maybe they were going through a slow news cycle, and they came out with an article on the Gospel of Judas, as if that was some new discovery. It wasn't. It had been around for quite some time. But they were postulating, gee, maybe this is a book of the Bible that just somehow missed the cut. Why, what gives it less right to be part of the Bible than all the other books like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or like Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. Likewise, when we talk to our Roman Catholic friends, they will open their Bible and they'll have the Old Testament, they'll have the New Testament, and they'll have a series of other books that have commonly been referred to as the Apocryphal or the Deuterocanonical books. That is the sort of the extra canon. So how do we know that the right books are in the Bible? One of the things that deals with this is this issue of what we call canonicity. Now, canonicity refers to the church's recognition of the authority of the inspired writings, and that didn't happen all at once. That tended to happen gradually as the church came to recognize, but notice my definition is very important. Canonicity does not make a book inspired. Canonicity instead recognizes the authority of those inspired writings. What makes then a book to be inspired? And my answer is that it is the Holy Spirit that inspires the book, that gives his message to men, and it has been the job of both the people and later on the church to recognize what the Holy Spirit is doing. Now, for the Old Testament in particular, we have the testimony of Josephus. He was a first century writer, not a Christian, a Jewish person. And in defending Judaism, he says, "For we have not an innumerable multitude of books among us, disagreeing from and contradicting one another as the Greeks have, but only 22 books." And you say, wait a minute, John, aren't there 39 books in the Old Testament? Well, there are, but when he speaks of the 22 books, the Jews counted those books differently. For example, they were the same books, but for example, we refer to the minor prophets, and they just referred to that as one book. They called it the 12. Because there were 12 prophets in there. Likewise, we speak of 1st and 2nd Samuel, or 1st and 2nd Kings, or 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Each one of those they only counted one time. There was just the book of Samuel and the book of Kings and the book of Chronicles. And not sure exactly why, but Ezra and Nehemiah, probably because they are sort of I guess a pattern, or let me call them a box set. Ezra begins the story that is completed in Nehemiah, and they counted Ezra and Nehemiah as one book. So when Josephus talks about the 22 books, he's talking about the same books that make our 39 books of our Old Testament. And so he says they only have 22 books which contain the records of all the pastimes which are justly believed to be divine, that is, they're from God. Now he's saying this in his book Contra Appian. He goes on to say, "It is true our history has been written since Artaxerxes very peculiarly, but has not been esteemed of the like authority with the former by our forefathers, because there has not been an exact succession of prophets since that time." Notice what Josephus is doing. He's saying that the prophets spoke and scriptures were there. It was the scriptures that came about from the speaking of the prophets. But there came a time when the prophets stopped speaking, when there were no prophets, and so therefore those writings that came after that, like what we call the Apocrypha, they were not bad writings. They told the story of what took place after the close of the Old Testament canon, but they were not esteemed by the Jews to have the same authority as the Scriptures, because they had not been given by prophets. That means our English Old Testament can be divided into several phases, I guess, several sections. First of all, there are those books that we call the Pentateuch. Now, Penta just means the 5, so these are the 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Same books that the And when we look at the Hebrew Bible, it's going to refer to that as the Torah. Next come the historical books. And the historical books go from Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And they tell the rest of the history of the Old Testament period. And we come to the last couple of books there, and we're finished with the history, Israel, the creation of the nation of Israel, them moving into the land, them being driven out of the land, them coming back into the land, them surviving, and all those things. That's the historical books. The story of the Old Testament is done, but the Old Testament itself isn't finished. There are two other sections. The next section is what we call the poetic books, books of poetry, and these comprise Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and those are all written during the time of the historical books. So they are sort of a parallel set of books, and they are, for the most part, just books of poetry. There are some prose sections in a couple of those, but largely they are books of poetry. So we have the historical books, the poetic books, and finally the prophets. The prophetical books start with Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel. Those we refer to as the major prophets. And then the minor prophets, or what the Jews called the 12, Hosea all the way down to Malachi. Now the Hebrew Bible has exactly the same books, but they are arranged in a different order. We start off with the Torah, which corresponds to the Pentateuch, again, Genesis through Deuteronomy. Then we have the prophets, the way you say that in Hebrew is the Navi'im, the prophets. And what they refer to as the prophets includes what we described as the historical books, but it also has some of the prophets as well. So Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12, that is what we call the minor prophets. So I have the Torah, which just means the law or the instruction, the prophets, the Navi'im, and finally the writings, the way you say that in Hebrew is the Ketuvim. These are the writings. Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Solomon. Those are parts of what we call the historical books. But also then Ruth, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. Those are all considered to be a separate section, part of the writings. Now, one of the questions that we next ask is the textual question, and this asks the question, can our copies of the Bible be trusted? Because what we have when we look at our Old Testament, or New Testament too for that matter, we don't have the original piece of paper or parchment or stone or on whatever it was written. We don't have the original. We have copies. Actually, we have copies of copies of copies. And so we could trace it out this way. There's the original manuscript, for example, of Genesis or Exodus, Leviticus, and then there were copies made of that original manuscript, and then there were copies made of the copies, and then copies of the copies of the copies, and so on. Moving down a great deal. And perhaps we can imagine, maybe we played that little game in grade school where you told a secret to somebody and they turned around and whispered it to somebody else and they whispered it to a following person. And by the time it got around the room, it had changed drastically. And that brings up the question, can we trust the original, the copies that we have, not having the original manuscripts? One of the things that has helped us along the way was back in 1947, some shepherds were at a place called Qumran by the shores of the Dead Sea, and you can even from here on this picture you can see some of the caves that are there. And a shepherd boy was looking for a lost goat, and he took a rock and threw it into one of those caves, expecting to hear a bah, and maybe a goat would come running out. And instead, he heard a crash, tinkle, tinkle, and he said, "That's odd." And he and a friend the next day went up and searched that cave out. And they found some pots, one now broken with a rock in it, but they contained scrolls. So these were the famous Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, when they took the scrolls, and archaeologists eventually went back and looked for others, they found that those original scrolls were 1,000 years older than any previous Hebrew manuscript of the Bible. And eventually, like I said, they went back and they searched for, other scrolls. They thought, well, gee, these might not be the only ones here. And so in these mountains along the Dead Sea. They ended up finding scrolls in about, I think it's 15 to 17 different caves. Maybe more, maybe a few more now. So that they found copies, at least portions of copies, of nearly every book of the Old Testament. And a study of comparison was made to compare that newer find, actually that ancient find, it was new to us, but that those ancient manuscripts with the oldest manuscripts that we already had. And although there were some occasional subtle differences, usually when you might have a number, somebody might have written 40 instead of 4, or things like that, they were amazingly accurate. Very little difference. Also some spelling differences and things like that. But largely the bigger message was unchanged. It was amazing how accurate, spanning 1,000 years, how accurate the manuscripts were. The copies that we had were very, very accurate. And so today we can look at, for example, there's a picture of the Isaiah scroll, and we can read it and we can compare it and understand that yes, the message that we have in the Bible has been saved for us to a remarkable degree. Now, next we approach the question of hermeneutics. Hermes was the Greek messenger god. The Romans called him Mercury, and that's where we get the name for that planet that goes so fast around the sun because it's so close to the sun. But Hermes was the messenger god, and so hermeneutics is the science of the message, or the science of interpretation of the message. And it asks the question, how can I read the Bible and understand it? After all, lots of people have read the Bible and come to all sorts of different conclusions. Is it merely just a matter of conjecture? And so some fundamental questions that are asked in the approach of hermeneutics. First of all, we ask the question, what did it mean as we read any given passage, any given verse, any given chapter? What did it mean to the original characters of the narrative? And this is especially appropriate if we're looking at a historical section where it's giving a narrative section, but not limited to that. I should ask that even with those non-narrative sections. But what did it mean to the original characters of the narrative? Secondly, what did it mean to the author? Now that's a little bit different because the author might be far removed from the original characters of the narrative. On the one hand, he might be one of them. On the other hand, he might be removed by hundreds or even thousands of years. But what did it mean to the author? And then thirdly, what did it mean to the original recipients who, for whom, those people for whom the author wrote? He's writing to a particular audience. What did it mean to that audience? We can look at this. Let's take the example of Adam and Eve. We see them and they're in the garden, and we can, sort of put ourselves into their sandals or lack of them, because remember, initially they're sort of unclothed, and then as they're cast out of the garden, the Lord makes coats of skin. But we can read their story of being in the garden and facing temptation and now being cast out of the garden, and we try to put ourselves into their place as we read through the story. But then we also recognize that it is Moses who's the storyteller. He's writing hundreds and maybe even thousands of years later, after them. And so he's writing at a much later period, and he's writing to a different audience. He's not writing this for Adam and Eve to read because they've long since been dead. He's writing to the Israelites who have come out of Egypt, and they're wandering in the wilderness. So maybe there's a little... they can empathize a bit, because just like Adam and Eve were cast out of the garden, the Israelites have moved out. They weren't cast out, but they've moved out of Egypt that was very garden-like, and they've moved out into the wilderness. And so they read this with a very different emphasis in mind. But we don't stop there. Now we look at it through the pages of our Bible. We're reading it from a 21st century perspective. And certainly we're reading it having the whole Bible in view. Remember, Moses didn't have the whole Bible. He just had the parts that he had written. The New Testament hadn't been written yet. Lots of the Old Testament hadn't been written yet. But we have the completed revelation. And so we can bring that to bear in our examination. And we are seeking to put it in our context today. And so we might look at our lives and recognize, there's as I look around myself, I'm not in a garden. My daily experiences might be a little bit wilderness-like, and I can identify with those situations about which I am reading. So, what did it mean to the original recipients? Next, I asked, what does it mean in light of New Testament revelation? Because the New Testament gives us greater insight, gives us a running commentary on the Old Testament, and it explains to us in greater detail as God has continued to reveal himself and his plan and his program.